Well, welcome to In the Word in our spring, summer, and fall reading program. In the next 6 months, we'll be going through the Bible together, a chapter at a time, from Romans through the book of Revelation. So I hope you enjoy this, hope you're edified by it, built up in the Lord. Hope you are encouraged to continue reading in the Bible. You know, the Bible is an absolutely transformative book. No one can read the Bible and go away unchanged. And I hope to educate you, clue you in on some things that maybe you'd miss otherwise. So let's launch in. I'll give you an overview of the book of Romans. Sometimes it's helpful to have a framework. There's a introduction and a conclusion at the front and back, and we'll talk about those when we get to them. But really the core of the book is focused on 5 sections. The first section is all about sin. It goes from chapter 1, verse 18 to chapter 3, verse 20. It's all about sin, the need for righteousness. You know, the theme of the book is the righteous will live by faith. Paul first sets up the need for righteousness, which is universal. And then in the next section, so the first section is about sin. The next major section is about salvation. Goes from 3:21, chapter 3, verse 21, to chapter 5, verse 21. It's all about God's grace, the righteousness that's provided to us. So the first section's about the need for righteousness. Second section's about the righteousness provided. And then the third section, which goes from chapter 6, verse 1 to the end of chapter 8, verse 39, I think, is about sanctification. That is, working out your salvation, as it says in Philippians, living out the righteousness that's been given to us, that's been imparted to us. So the first part is righteousness needed. Second part is righteousness provided. And the third part is righteousness imparted, living that out. And then in chapter 9, verse 1, through the end of chapter 11, verse 36, chapter 11, verse 36, is a section that I call righteousness assured. That is, we see the victory over sin, we see God's glory. It's about God's sovereignty. So we have sin, salvation, sanctification. The fourth part is sovereignty, righteousness assured. And then the fifth and final section before the conclusion is starts in chapter 12, verse 1, and goes through about middle part of chapter 15, verse 13. And that's about righteousness applied. That is the living out our righteousness in our church, in our home, in our relationships with others. So it's about service. So again, just to recap, chapter 1, 18 through chapter 3, verse 20 is about sin and righteousness required or needed. Chapter 3, verse 21 through chapter 5, verse 21 is about salvation or righteousness provided. Chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 8, verse 39 is about sanctification or righteousness imputed. Chapter 9, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 36 is about sovereignty, God's sovereignty, or righteousness assured. And then the final section, chapter 12, verse 1 through chapter 15, verse 13, is about service or righteousness applied. So let's dive into the introduction here, the first part, chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. I'll break this down a little bit for you. I'd encourage you to watch the video every day before you do your reading. It'll give you some guidance and direction as you go through your reading, things to watch for. Verses 1 through 6, I wanted to point out that the letter is from Paul, and he's talking all about Jesus, and Jesus is the one who has been promised throughout the whole Bible, throughout the whole Old Testament, that Jesus has been the hope of Israel. He has been promised. He has been looked forward to, and Paul is saying that he has arrived, that the one who has been looked forward to has finally come. And he's going to talk about that throughout the rest of the letter. He also points out that Jesus is David's son. Well, this is important, and you're going to see this worked out through all the letters culminating in the book of Revelation. By being David's son, Jesus is king. He's king over Israel, and he's Messiah. He's Messiah, the Savior of the nation. This has been promised throughout the Bible. In 2 Samuel 7, verses 8 through 16, we have what's called the Davidic Covenant, where David is promised to have an eternal king on his throne someday. In 1 Chronicles 17, verses 4 through 14, this promise is reiterated. And it's talked about again in Psalm 89, verses 1 through 4 particularly. And then throughout the epistles as we go through here, if you came with me on looking at the life of Jesus in the first part of the year, you see Jesus' offer of the kingdom and its rejection in Matthew chapter 12. We see this great anticipation throughout the epistles of Jesus coming. And that's what Paul is talking about here. That Jesus is king. He will ultimately bring a kingdom. The kingdom will come to the earth. And we'll see that 6 months from now in Revelation chapter 20. We see Jesus return to establish his reign and rule on the earth for 1,000 years. And then according to 1 Corinthians 15, he turns that kingdom over to the Father, where we go into what's called the eternal state. So that's verses 1 through 6 of our introduction. And then I also wanted to point out then Paul launches into a prayer for the Romans who he has not met. I think that's a great example for us. Prays for 3 things as you read through verses 8 through 12, and be a good pattern for our prayer if we want to pray like an apostle. Fellowship, he prays for fellowship with them in verse 10. He's saying he's longing to see them coming to you. Verse 11, he's praying for unity, that he wants to come and take his role in among the believers there and strengthen them in verse 11 through his gift. And then in verse 12, he prays for community, that is to be mutually encouraged, that he be part of a dynamic community encouraging one another in verse 12. So he prays for 3 things: fellowship, unity, and community. And then in verses 16 and 17 is really the core of the book, or the theme of the book. Let me read that for us. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For," and that "for" signals he's given us his reason for saying this. "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." And what he's doing there is he's quoting Habakkuk 2:4. And he's saying that the basis of life for the righteous person is their faith in God. And that's going to be the theme of the book. Verse 18, then, we transition into this first section talking about sin and the righteousness that's needed. The outline here as you go through these verses from 18 through 32 is we see in verses 18 through 23, basically that sin makes you stupid. Yes, that's what I said. Sin makes you stupid. Look at verse 22. "Claiming to be wise," these are the people who reject God, "claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." So in these verses 18 through 23, I think the big idea is sin makes you stupid. 24, verses 24 to 27, we see that sin ultimately ruins sex. Look at verse 27, talking about God giving people over to dishonorable passions. Men likewise giving up natural relationships with women, and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Before this, in verse 26, it talks about the same sin among women. So, sin makes you stupid, sin ruins sex, and verses 28 through 32, sin loves company. Look at the end of this in verse 32. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give their approval to those who practice them. So in this final section, verses 18 through 32, we see that sin makes you stupid, sin ruins sex, and sin loves company. So, what can we draw from this? What kind of edification or encouragement can we possibly draw from these verses about sin? Well, I'd say first is that what's depicted here is what happens when God abandons or turns over a people to their own sin, or even a nation. If you look, if you want to study this further, there's a parallel in Isaiah chapters 1 through 5 of God turning Israel over to their sin and abandoning them to that sin, which culminates in chapter 6 of Isaiah, where God sends Isaiah to Israel with the warning that he'll be speaking to them, but they will not listen. He's turned them over. We also gives us a framework to understand the times that we live in. We need to understand and discern the times we live in, because we want to resist the culture that's all around us, that's begging us, pressuring us, driving us to abandon God and become stupid, to engage in or approve of sex and sexual practices that God rejects, and to be drawn in to the sin of other people, because we know sin loves company. So we want to be careful and discern the times we live in order to live wisely. While we wait for this coming kingdom that Jesus has promised for us, we wait for his glorious appearing when he will take the church to be with him, and then we will return with him at his second coming, and we'll talk about these in subsequent chapters. We'll come with him at his second coming and rule and reign with him on the earth. Finally, although this looks hopeless, we know for a fact that there are still people on the earth that God is intending to save. We know that because the church is still here. As long as the church is here, God's elect are still on the earth, and they're waiting to hear the gospel. That's where you and I come in. We need to share the good news that Jesus has come, that the King of Israel, the Messiah, the promised one bringing salvation, has come. And we can escape the wrath that's coming down from God by just simply putting our faith in his finished work at the cross. More about this later as we go through the book of Romans. But right now, as we look in this first section, the introduction, and this first section that introduces the pervasiveness of sin, I want you to walk away, brothers and sisters, not only discerning the times that we live in, but feeling anxious for those around us who need to hear the gospel. Share the gospel with someone this week. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Hope you are encouraged and edified and educated in your reading of God's word today.